Welcome to Policy on Demand. I'm Sindhu Blume.
And I'm Scott McCandless. It is the week of April 22nd, and this is your Monday briefing. On Saturday, the House passed several foreign aid bills before starting its one-week recess. The Senate is expected to consider the foreign aid legislation this week.
Last week, the Senate Finance Committee held a hearing on President Biden's FY25 IRS budget and the 2024 filing season with IRS Commissioner Daniel Werfel. At the hearing, Chairman Ron Wyden commended the IRS for its pilot of the direct file program and its improvements to customer service during the filing season. But Ranking Member Mike Crapo criticized the IRS's strategic operating plan and said additional IRS funding has not resulted in the expected transformation of the agency. Joining us from Houston to share her takeaways from the hearing and what companies need to know about current IRS operations is Nikole Flax. Nikole, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Nikole, I'm always so glad to talk to you, but I know that the things we talk about are stress points for our viewers, or can be. So let's start with last week's hearing, and what are your key takeaways, and how could hearings like this affect IRS operations?
Sure. So the hearing last week was actually, I'd say slightly less contentious than the typical IRS hearing. I think it's because they were coming off of a filing season which didn't have any major hiccups. And so there wasn't a lot to discuss with respect to the filing season in particular. Most of the attention, as you just mentioned, was around the IRS's direct file pilot. And just a little bit of background, as part of the Inflation Reduction Act, in addition to the additional funding that the IRS got for transformation, they were given $15 million that was designated for use for a direct file pilot. And so they are just coming off the initial round of that pilot. And there are vastly different views around the appropriateness of the IRS having a direct file program. And so most of the hearing really was about that, coupled with the administration's more recent budget request to add to the additional funds that the IRS has been provided. And it's really not new. It had to happen because the way that those initial funds were provided, there is a cliff effect, and they are gone after about 7 years from now. And so it's just a recognition that if the IRS wants to continue in the path that they're on, that there are additional funding needs, and that's obviously very controversial. With respect to where the agency is heading, the IRS commissioner really reiterated the same messages that he has been sharing with respect to service and enforcement and where they're spending their immediate effort. So there weren't any immediate changes to that direction.
Nikole, the IRS has sought to use the additional IRS funding to enhance taxpayer services and increase enforcement. Can you talk about the impact of these investments?
Sure. So with respect to service and enforcement, the approach is slightly different. So in the service lane, the IRS has been focusing on the last year and a half on the broadest issues. So the issues that impact hundreds of millions of taxpayers, things like phone service, trying to move away from paper processes, some of the basics that taxpayers have been struggling with over the last many years. And in the service lane, there is much less funding that's been provided to the IRS. So there was only about $3 billion, and I say only given that the total package, even after about $20 billion of enforcement was taken back, they have over $40 billion, but only $3 billion of it is in service. And I think, it is widely recognized that the IRS has a number of service challenges. So in the service area, they have been trying to have a broader impact and really address some of those basics that I think taxpayers just expect the IRS to be able to deliver. Enforcement is much, much different. As we talked about in the past, the administration immediately put in a directive to the IRS that none of that enforcement funding can be used to increase audits for taxpayers making under $400,000. And so the enforcement efforts are focused on a much smaller population of taxpayers. It is limited to high-income individuals, large corporations, and large complex partnerships. And so there really is kind of an imbalance in the approach where the service approach is focused, generally on the taxpayer base as a whole, and the enforcement approach is focused on a more narrow set of taxpayers.
And Nikole, with the space that enforcement takes up, It likely will result, I'm assuming, in more appeals by taxpayers. So could you talk about changes we're seeing in appeals?
Yes, so that's right. So as enforcement increases, and especially with respect to the taxpayers that I just talked about, so high income taxpayers, complex taxpayers, that obviously leads to more disputes in the examination functions of the IRS. And as part of that, and this is traditionally the case, as IRS grows the examination functions, they also attempt to grow the appeals function because they understand there will be an impact to the number of taxpayers that would like to get to the IRS Office of Appeals. So they are actively doing that. It's also the case as the IRS is increasing work in areas where they haven't had a huge presence in the past, that especially in the earlier years, you're going to have a number of disputes just as things really normalize in terms of taxpayers having a clearer view of what the IRS's position is on something, or the IRS may realize that they're spending a lot of time on an issue that at the end of the day, they don't have the position correctly. And so just some of the kind of the growing pains in terms of taking on new issues. At the same time, in addition to appeals growing, they are trying to reinforce and re-energize some of the ADR programs, the dispute resolution programs that exist in addition to just traditional appeals. And a couple weeks ago, they announced a foreshadowing of announcements that are to come from the IRS with respect to a number of those popular options. I think it's really good news for taxpayers in showing that they want to give taxpayers an opportunity to take advantage of these programs. I think the two most worthy changes are with respect to the fast track settlement program and also post appeals mediation. What they're doing is they're requiring a higher level of review if the exam team or the appeals officer denies a taxpayer's request for use of those programs. And what they explain is that traditionally they know that sometimes the IRS employees and the appeals employees are they're dug in on their issues and they don't want to allow those programs because they just don't see that they're going to that they're going to resolve the disputes. And what they're looking to do is really try to get a higher level involvement in there to ensure that taxpayers have an opportunity to use those programs. So I think it's definitely a good move for taxpayers.
And Nikole, finally, what actions could business and individual taxpayers consider taking now that the IRS has increased its enforcement efforts?
So I think there are a few. I think one is just being mindful of where the IRS is spending their attention. And they have been very public about the areas that they are looking to increase coverage. Since about last September, every 2 weeks or so, there is a new public announcement of a focus area. And so I would definitely stay abreast of those changes so that companies can be prepared. They're talking about particular taxpayer segments that they're looking to grow coverage, but also particular issues that they're focused on. And there's been a lot in the press in the last few weeks, for example, of an announcement around personal use of corporate aircraft. So if you are a company that has those issues, it would make sense to make sure that that your paperwork is aligned, that your policies are appropriate, et cetera, because it's pretty clear the IRS is going to look at that issue if they were to audit. The other is for companies that haven't had a lot of IRS involvement in the last many years, just being familiar with their policies and procedures. In the large business area in particular, there are a lot of opportunities for taxpayers to engage with the exam team, to have more of a cooperative process. And so it is important to know when those opportunities exist so that you can push for those as you are moving forward. And then just at the broadest scope is just to ensure that you have audit-ready files, that if the IRS were to contact you, that you have a good sense of what your risks are, et cetera. So I think there are a number of steps that companies can be taking to get ready for where the IRS is heading.
Nikole, that's great. Thank you so much for your many insights and for your advice for companies and individuals. Thank you.
Sure.
And for our viewers, you'll find in the description of this episode a link to the latest Week in Review, last week's episode of Election Watch, and a special episode on the stock buyback regulations. And stay tuned for another Week in Review coming up this Friday.
And as always, thank you so much for spending this time with us, and we hope you have a great week. Take care.